A single war stretched across 5 generations of human life. This was the 100 Years' War, a sprawling conflict that redefined the map of Europe through a chaotic rhythm of explosive battles and fragile truces. It was a monumental struggle between England and France, fought over royal bloodlines and the very idea of a nation. We will walk through the legendary battles where legends were born and broken. We will meet the ambitious kings who gambled their kingdoms for a crown. We will uncover the revolutionary military strategies that shattered ancient traditions. And we will follow the constantly shifting political alliances that made every decade unpredictable. By the end, you will understand how this century of conflict forged the very concept of the modern nation and permanently transformed the art of war. How could a teenage peasant girl change the fate of 2 mighty kingdoms? And what secret made the English longbow one of history's most devastating weapons? When you think of a conflict that shaped our world, what story comes to mind first? The true cause of the war was a tangled knot of royal blood, one that could not be easily cut. When King Charles IV of France died in 1328, he left no son to inherit his crown. This created a void of power that sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe. Across the Channel, the young King Edward III of England saw his opportunity. He was the son of Isabella, the late French king's sister, making him Charles's closest male relative through a direct bloodline. In his mind, his claim was clear and legitimate, but the French Assembly of Barons saw things differently. They invoked an old legal code known as Salic law, which they interpreted as forbidding the crown from passing through a woman. They argued that since Edward's claim came from his mother, it was invalid. Instead, they offered the throne to Philip of Valois, a cousin of the dead king, who was crowned Philip VI of France. Edward was forced to swallow this bitter pill, at least for a time. He initially paid homage to Philip for his own lands in France, a humiliating act for a fellow king. The heart of these English holdings was the rich and sprawling duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France. For centuries, this arrangement had been a source of deep resentment. The King of England was, in his role as Duke of Aquitaine, a vassal to the King of France. This meant he was expected to kneel and swear loyalty for lands he considered his own. Can you imagine the simmering anger of a monarch forced to bow to a man he viewed as a usurper? This volatile mix of a disputed crown and a deeply flawed feudal relationship created a political powder keg. All it needed was a single spark to ignite a century of fire. That single spark came in 1337, when Philip VI made a decisive move. He declared the Duchy of Aquitaine forfeit and sent his armies to seize it. This was not just a land grab, it was a direct challenge that Edward III could not ignore. Edward responded with an act of breathtaking ambition, formally declaring himself the rightful King of France in 1340. This was the true opening gambit, a move that transformed a feudal squabble into a fight for the very crown of France. To make this claim a reality, Edward needed to control the sea. The English Channel was the vital artery for moving his troops and supplies, and in 1340, his fleet met the powerful French navy at the port of Slues. The result was not just a victory but a near-total annihilation. The English archers firing from the decks of their ships turned the water into a graveyard of French vessels. This stunning naval triumph gave England complete command of the Channel, securing a vital gateway into France for decades to come. But the true shock to the established order was still to come on land 6 years later. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the French army, a massive force of heavily armored knights representing the flower of French nobility charged confidently against the English lines. They were met with a storm. Thousands of English longbowmen unleashed a hail of arrows so dense and so fast that it darkened the sky. The French knights, trained for a century of chivalric combat, were cut down in droves. Their expensive plate armor was useless against arrows that fell from above, piercing shoulders and horseflesh. This was a tactical revolution, a demonstration that disciplined commoners with a simple longbow could destroy the most elite and expensive warrior class in Europe. The humiliation for France was not over. A decade after Crécy, Edward's son, the dashing Black Prince, found himself cornered by a much larger French army near Poitiers. Against all odds, he not only fought his way out but achieved the unthinkable. He captured the French king himself, John II. The king was taken as a prisoner to England, a catastrophic blow to French leadership and national pride. With their king in captivity, the French were forced to the negotiating table. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 seemed to end the war on English terms. Edward III gave up his grand claim to the French throne, but in return he received something perhaps more valuable: full and total sovereignty over a massively expanded Aquitaine. He would no longer be a vassal to any French king. This peace, however, was built on French defeat and shame. It felt less like a true conclusion and more like a bitter pause, a chance for a wounded kingdom to catch its breath and plot its return. Yet the power of the longbow was not born on the battlefield alone. Its true story begins in the quiet villages and greenwoods of England, where the sound of practice was a constant hum. This was not a weapon you could simply pick up and master. A skilled longbowman was forged through a lifetime of training, starting as a young boy to develop the unique and powerful muscles required. The bow itself, often as tall as a man, was crafted from a single, resilient stave of yew wood. To draw its string back a full 30 inches required immense strength, a strength that could permanently deform a skeleton, leaving archers with twisted spines and enlarged arm bones easily identifiable in their graves. This was the human cost of creating a weapon system that could loose a dozen arrows in a single minute, each capable of piercing plate armor at a distance of 200 yards. Think of the sheer discipline involved, the years of relentless practice that transformed common men into the artillery of their age. On the field, their tactics were as refined as their skill. Archers did not stand in open, chaotic mobs. They were deployed in disciplined formations on the flanks of an army, often hammering sharpened stakes into the ground before their positions as a simple, brutal defense against charging cavalry. When the signal came, they did not aim at individual knights. They loosed in unified volleys, sending a dark cloud of arrows arcing high into the air. These arrows fell like steel rain, a terrifying and indiscriminate storm that slaughtered horses and punched through the weak points in a knight's armor. A heavily armored French nobleman, the product of a lifetime of wealth and martial training, could be killed in an instant by a man who cost the crown almost nothing. This was the great military democratization of the Middle Ages. The longbow made the individual knight, the central figure of medieval warfare for centuries, suddenly vulnerable and often obsolete. It forced a complete rethinking of what an army should be, proving that innovation, discipline, and the power of the common man could topple the most entrenched traditions of the battlefield. Just as the longbow began to reshape the battlefield, a far more terrifying force arrived to reshape the entire world. In 1347, a silent fleet of death sailed into the port of Messina, carrying a disease that would become known as the Black Death. This was the bubonic plague, a pandemic that showed no loyalty to king or country. It swept across Europe with horrifying speed, leaving mountains of the dead in its wake. By the time its fury subsided around 1351, it had killed an unimaginable number of people, perhaps 1 out of every 2 souls living in Europe. Entire villages vanished. The social and economic fabric of both England and France was torn apart. Armies, those dense collections of men, became perfect breeding grounds for the sickness. Campaigns were simply abandoned as soldiers died in their camps, not from enemy arrows but from fever and grotesque swellings. The war itself was forced into a reluctant, unspoken truce. How could you fight for a crown when the very act of gathering an army was a death sentence? The world had suddenly become much smaller, and human ambition seemed pitifully insignificant against a microscopic enemy. But from this unimaginable devastation, a strange and unexpected shift began. With so many people dead, the survivors found themselves in a new position of power. The scarcity of labor meant that those who worked the land and practiced trades could suddenly demand higher wages and better conditions. The old feudal order, already strained by the cost of war, began to crack under this new economic pressure. The common man, who had proven his worth on the fields of Crécy with a longbow, was now finding a new kind of leverage in the fields and workshops of a half-empty continent. The plague had not just paused a war, it had irrevocably changed the players, setting the stage for a conflict that would return, but in a world forever altered. Out of the shadow of plague and defeat, a new kind of French king emerged. Charles V, called the Wise, was not a warrior who led charges, but a strategist who understood his enemy's weakness. He had witnessed the carnage at Poitiers and learned its brutal lesson. He would never again offer the English the pitched battle they so desperately wanted. Instead, he turned to a man of brutal cunning, his constable Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight who looked nothing like the chivalric ideal but fought with a ruthless pragmatism. Together, they crafted a new form of warfare, one of patience and pressure. This was the strategy of the chevauchée, though in their hands it became a defensive masterpiece. Rather than burning the countryside, they targeted the English grip on the land itself. Du Guesclin's forces became ghosts, melting away whenever a large English army appeared, only to solidify again and strike at vulnerable supply caravans or isolated outposts. They focused on the slow, unglamorous work of siegecraft, surrounding fortified town after town and starving them into submission. This methodical reclamation was a war of exhaustion. It leveraged France's greatest advantage, its vast interior territory and deeper resources, against an English army stretched thin across the Channel. How do you defeat an enemy who refuses to stand and fight on your terms? You make the war itself unsustainable. One by one, the strongholds and territories so proudly won by Edward III and the Black Prince were quietly taken back. Castles fell not in a dramatic storm of arrows, but in the silent, grinding months of a blockade. By the time Charles V died in 1380, his life's work was complete. The map of France had been largely restored, the humiliating Treaty of Bretigny rendered meaningless, all without a single, glorious Crécy or Poitiers. He proved that a kingdom could be saved not by the sword alone, but by the brilliant, calculating mind of a king who knew that sometimes the greatest victory is won by refusing to play your opponent's game. Just as the French crown seemed to regain its footing, the very foundation of medieval society fractured from within. In 1378, the Catholic Church, the one institution that united all of Western Europe, tore itself in two. This was the Great Schism, a crisis that saw not one, but two men simultaneously claiming to be the one true pope. One held his court in Rome, while the other established a rival papacy in the French city of Avignon. For nearly 40 years, this spiritual civil war raged, and the kings of England and France did not hesitate to turn this religious chaos into a political weapon. Each nation naturally backed the pope who served their interests. France and its allies championed the pope in Avignon, while England and its partners threw their support behind the pope in Rome. This was not merely a matter of faith, it was a calculated move for immense worldly power. A king could now appeal to his own friendly pope for financial subsidies to fund his armies, for declarations that branded his enemy a heretic, and for the spiritual legitimacy that made his cause seem divinely ordained. How could a common soldier question a war that his own pope had blessed? The schism effectively nationalized faith, turning God into a political ally. This religious division added a profound and bitter layer to the conflict, framing the struggle for land and crowns as a holy war. The battlefield was no longer just in France, it was in every cathedral and every conscience across the continent, proving that in the medieval world, the quest for earthly power and the destiny of souls were two sides of the very same coin. A strange quiet fell over the war. The furious campaigns and grand battles gave way to a long, uneasy truce, but this peace was born not from victory, but from sickness and decay within the very hearts of both kingdoms. In England, the throne was held by Richard II, a boy king who grew into a troubled and isolated man. His reign was haunted by the ghost of his grandfather, Edward III, and the immense shadow cast by his father, the Black Prince. Richard faced constant challenges from his powerful barons, men who saw his youth and his temperament as weaknesses to be exploited. This internal pressure boiled over in 1381, erupting into the Peasants' Revolt. Tens of thousands of commoners, armed with a new sense of power and grievance after the Black Death, marched on London. They demanded an end to serfdom and denounced the corruption of the ruling class. For a few terrifying days, the king was trapped by the fury of his own people, a clear sign that England's greatest threat was no longer French cavalry, but its own fractured society. Across the Channel, the French monarchy faced a crisis of a different, more personal nature. King Charles VI had begun his reign with promise, but soon descended into a terrifying and unpredictable madness. He suffered from violent fits, at times forgetting he was king and running wildly through his own castle, convinced his body was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. This royal insanity created a vacuum of power that the great noble houses of France were all too eager to fill. Two factions in particular lunged for control, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. The Duke of Burgundy, a powerful ruler in his own right, saw a chance to expand his influence over the entire kingdom. His rivals, the Armagnacs, led by the king's own brother, fought just as fiercely to stop him. The French court became a snake pit of intrigue and assassination, a civil war in all but name, with England paralyzed by rebellion and France tearing itself apart from the top down. Neither nation had the strength or the stable leadership to launch a new offensive. The great conflict was put on hold not by treaty but by mutual collapse. This fragile peace was a mask hiding the deep cracks in both crowns, cracks that a new and ambitious king would soon learn to exploit with devastating precision. Into this power vacuum stepped a king who believed his destiny was written by God himself. Henry V of England was a young, charismatic, and ruthlessly determined monarch, and he saw the French Civil War not as a reason for peace, but as a perfect opportunity for total conquest. He revived the old claim to the French throne, a banner that had not been flown so boldly since Edward III, and he did so with a clear, unwavering objective. This was not about reclaiming a duchy or securing a better border. Henry sought nothing less than the complete and permanent union of the English and French crowns under his own House of Lancaster. In August of 1415, his army landed at the mouth of the Seine River in Normandy. He did not come to raid or to negotiate. He came to stay, and his first move was to lay siege to the vital port town of Harfleur. The siege was brutal and costly, with dysentery ravaging his ranks, but the town eventually fell. Yet Henry's campaign was now in peril. His army was weakened, the campaigning season was ending, and a massive French force was gathering to block his path. The logical move would have been to retreat to the safety of the English coast, but Henry V was not a logical king. He was a gambler who trusted in divine providence. He chose instead to march his sick and exhausted army over 200 miles to the English-held port of Calais, a daring move that seemed like utter madness. He was daring the French to give him the great, decisive battle they had avoided for a generation, and near a small village called Agincourt, they finally took the bait. The field at Agincourt was a death trap disguised by French confidence. After days of heavy rain, the ground between two dense woods had become a vast, churning bog of thick mud. Henry V positioned his weary men, perhaps 6,000 strong, across this narrow choke point. A raid against them was a French host at least 3 times their size, a glittering sea of knights and men at arms, fresh, well-fed, and utterly certain of an easy victory. They had learned nothing from the lessons of Crécy. The French nobility, eager for personal glory and ransoms, pushed to the front, creating a chaotic and cramped formation even before the battle began. When the order to advance was finally given, the French heavy cavalry led the charge, but their momentum died almost instantly. The horses, struggling in the deep mud, could not build up speed, and they were met by a forest of sharpened stakes that the English archers had hammered into the ground. Then the sky turned black. Thousands of English and Welsh longbowmen positioned on the flanks began their work. They loosed volley after volley of arrows in a high, arching trajectory. These arrows did not need to pierce plate armor directly. They fell like steel rain, piercing the less protected necks and shoulders of the knights and slaughtering the horses beneath them. The charge dissolved into a tangled, screaming heap of fallen men and panicked animals. The following waves of French infantry, weighed down by their own heavy armor, could only trudge slowly forward, pushing their fallen comrades deeper into the mire. They became a packed, suffocating mass, unable to raise their weapons effectively. This was not a battle, it was a systematic slaughter. English archers, dropping their bows, swarmed into the chaotic melee with axes and mallets, finishing off the helpless French knights where they lay. By the day's end, the French army was annihilated. Thousands of their greatest nobles and knights lay dead in the mud, a catastrophic loss that decapitated the French leadership for a generation. For England, Agincourt was more than a victory, it was a miracle. It forged the legend of Henry V as an invincible warrior king, a man seemingly blessed by God. But this legendary triumph, born from mud and blood, would create a political aftermath far more complex and challenging than the battle itself. Agincourt may have been won on the battlefield, but Henry V's true masterpiece was crafted in the quiet of a council chamber. With the French monarchy shattered by internal feuds and military disaster, he moved to secure his prize not with another bloody campaign, but with a stroke of a pen. In the year 1420, he engineered the Treaty of Troyes, a document of breathtaking political ambition. This was not a simple peace agreement. It was a blueprint for the complete and legal absorption of France into an English empire. The treaty hinged on a powerful and damning accusation. The French Dauphin Charles was formally disinherited. The English and their powerful allies, the Burgundians, publicly branded him a criminal, accusing him of being complicit in the brutal murder of the Burgundian Duke, John the Fearless. This act of political vengeance effectively erased the legitimate heir from the line of succession. In his place, the treaty named Henry V as the heir and regent of France. To seal this astonishing deal, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the mentally ill King Charles VI. He was now both the conqueror and the son-in-law, the foreign king, and the designated protector of the very realm he was invading. The final clause was the most audacious of all. It stated that upon the death of Charles VI, the crowns of England and France would be permanently united under Henry and his descendants. Can you grasp the sheer scale of this vision? This was the zenith of English ambition, a political solution designed to win the war outright by making the King of England also the King of France by legal right. The conflict was no longer a messy dispute over territory. It had been transformed, on paper at least, into a simple matter of royal succession. Henry had not just defeated the French army, he had seemingly rewritten their future, creating a bold and terrifying vision of a single, unified kingdom stretching across the Channel. But a signature on a treaty, no matter how clever, could not erase the deeply rooted loyalty of a people, or the simmering resolve of a disinherited prince waiting in the shadows. But a treaty signed in a distant city could not command the loyalty of a nation's heart. Just as the English vision of a united crown seemed within reach, an entirely unexpected voice rose from the fields of Lorraine. She was a teenage peasant girl named Joan, and she claimed the saints of heaven spoke to her. Her mission, delivered through divine visions, was as simple as it was impossible: to drive the English from the soil of France and to see the disinherited Dauphin crowned its rightful king. Few could have imagined that this uneducated girl would become the spark that would set the war ablaze once more. She brought with her an unshakable conviction that her cause was blessed by God Himself, and this fervor was infectious. After a rigorous examination by theologians who found her faith to be genuine, she was given a suit of white armor and a place at the head of a relief army marching to the besieged city of Orleans. The French forces there were demoralized and on the verge of surrender, trapped by a ring of English fortifications. Joan rode directly into the chaos of war, carrying a banner instead of a sword, and her presence alone seemed to change everything. She embodied a certainty that had been lost for years. Where the French soldiers saw a military deadlock, she saw a holy task that could not fail. Her sheer force of will broke the paralysis of the French command. She led assaults from the front, inspiring the troops to levels of bravery they had forgotten they possessed. In just a matter of days, the English siege lines crumbled and the city was liberated. The victory at Orleans was more than a tactical win. It was a thunderclap that shattered the aura of English invincibility built over decades. An army led by a peasant girl had achieved what seasoned French generals could not. With the momentum now firmly behind her, Joan turned to her second sacred duty. She escorted the hesitant Dauphin deep through hostile territory to the cathedral city of Reims, the ancient and traditional site for the coronation of French kings. There, with Joan standing proudly by his side, he was anointed with holy oil and crowned King Charles VII of France. This ceremony was a masterstroke of political and spiritual theater. It was not just a coronation, it was a rebirth of the French monarchy, a public act that transformed Charles from a disputed claimant into God's chosen king. Joan's true impact was not in her skill with a sword, but in the story she made real. She single-handedly reframed the entire conflict. It was no longer a complex dynastic squabble between two rival royal houses, a fight that many common French people found difficult to care about. Under her banner, it became a sacred struggle for the very soul of the nation, a holy war of liberation. She gave the French people a cause worth dying for, and in doing so, she gave their king a kingdom. The glory that surrounded Joan of Arc was as fragile as it was brilliant. Her capture at the siege of Compiègne in 1430 was not the result of a grand battle, but a simple tactical mishap. As her forces retreated into the city, she was left outside the gates when the portcullis were slammed shut, and Burgundian soldiers swiftly took her prisoner. For the English, this was a prize beyond measure. They had not been able to defeat her on the battlefield, so they would destroy her in a court of law. The Burgundians, their allies, sold her to the English for a substantial sum, and she was transported to the city of Rouen, the very heart of the English occupation in France. Her trial for heresy and witchcraft was never meant to be a search for truth. It was a meticulously staged political spectacle designed to achieve one goal: to shatter the divine legitimacy she had given to King Charles VII. If they could prove Joan a heretic, then the king she had crowned would be seen as a fraud, his authority resting on the words of a witch. For months, a tribunal of pro-English clergymen subjected her to relentless questioning. They probed her visions, demanding to know why she trusted voices they claimed were demonic. They fixated on her decision to wear men's clothing, her suit of armor, arguing it was a violation of church law and a sign of deep sin. How could a young woman, isolated and with no formal education, withstand such a coordinated attack from the most learned men in the room? Yet, in the face of this overwhelming pressure, Joan's responses were marked by a stunning clarity and a sharp wit. She deftly parried their theological traps, often answering with a simple, unshakable faith that left her interrogators frustrated. She refused to deny the reality of the voices that had guided her. After a grueling psychological ordeal and the threat of immediate execution, she momentarily broke, signing a document of abjuration she likely could not even read. But days later, tormented by what she had done, she recanted, choosing to reclaim her truth even if it meant her death. The judges had what they needed. She was condemned as a relapsed heretic. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, she was led to the old marketplace in Rouen and tied to a tall pillar. The fire was lit. Her final word was heard to be the name of Jesus. The English authorities scattered her ashes into the Seine River, believing they had erased her from history. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had not killed a heretic, they had created a martyr. The story of her courageous death spread across France with a power her life alone could never have achieved. The girl who heard saints had been murdered by her enemies, and in that act, her legend was forged into something unbreakable. She became the ultimate symbol of French resistance, a sacred figure whose sacrifice proved that the spirit of a nation could not be defeated by fire or fear. The murder of Duke John the Fearless on a bridge in 1419 was not just a crime of passion, it was a political earthquake. The Duke had been lured to a meeting with the Dauphin Charles under a solemn promise of safe passage, only to be cut down by the Dauphin's own men. This single treacherous act sent shockwaves across Europe, and it handed the English their most valuable prize of the entire war, the unshakable alliance of Burgundy. The new Duke, Philip the Good, burning with a desire for vengeance against the man who had orchestrated his father's killing, threw the full weight of his duchy behind the English king, Henry V. This was the ultimate kingmaker entering the game. Burgundy was no ordinary fiefdom. Over generations, its dukes had skillfully expanded their territories, weaving together a rich and powerful state that stretched from the heart of France to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Its wealth, drawn from the wool trade and the great commercial cities of Flanders, rivaled that of the French crown itself. The Duke commanded a modern, professional army and controlled Paris, the symbolic capital of France. So when Burgundy allied with England, it fundamentally changed the balance of power. This partnership gave the English something they had never truly possessed: a secure and powerful foothold deep within France itself. English armies were no longer foreign invaders operating on hostile coastlines. They were welcomed partners, supplied and reinforced through Burgundian lands. The crucial Treaty of Troyes, which named Henry V heir to France, would have been impossible to enforce without the Burgundians holding the capital and legitimizing the new order. How do you conquer a kingdom? You do not necessarily need to defeat its entire army in the field. Sometimes you only need to win the loyalty of the most powerful duke in the land, the one who holds the keys to its greatest city and commands the respect of its people. The war had never been a simple fight between two kings. It was a deadly chess match with three players, and for a critical generation, the Duke of Burgundy held the most powerful pieces on the board. The alliance that had anchored English power in France for a generation was about to shatter. In the year 1435, the great princes of Europe gathered at the Congress of Arras, a diplomatic summit called not to celebrate peace, but to realign the very future of the continent. For weeks, the envoys of England, France, and Burgundy negotiated in a tense, ceremonial dance. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, sat at the center of it all. His alliance with England had been forged in the fire of his father's murder, but after 16 years, the desire for vengeance had cooled, replaced by the practical needs of governing his vast and wealthy domains. He was now willing to listen. The English delegation, however, approached the talks with a stunning arrogance. They still saw themselves as the victors of Agincourt, the heirs to the French throne by the Treaty of Troyes. They refused to offer their longtime ally any meaningful concessions, believing Burgundy had no choice but to remain loyal. They fatally misjudged the Duke's patience and his ambition. Across the table, King Charles VII of France, the man Burgundy had once branded a murderer, played a far more clever game. Advised by brilliant ministers, Charles made an astonishing offer. He offered Philip a full and formal pardon for his father's death, absolving him of any association with the crime. More importantly, he granted the Duke of Burgundy something even more valuable: practical independence. Philip was released from his feudal obligation of homage for his lands, meaning he would no longer have to kneel and swear loyalty to the French king. He was effectively made a sovereign prince in his own right. This was a bitter pill for the French crown to swallow, but it was a masterstroke of realpolitik. The Treaty of Arras was signed, and the Burgundian Civil War was over. For England, the sound of that signing was the sound of a strategic collapse. Their most powerful partner, the ally who controlled Paris and supplied their armies, had just walked away. English forces on the continent were immediately isolated, cut off from their primary source of men, money, and supplies. The French king, his own kingdom finally unified, could now turn his full and undivided attention to a single goal: pushing the English into the sea. The tide of the war, which had ebbed and flowed for nearly a century, had just turned for the final time. The king who had been saved by a saint now had to prove he could rule like a sovereign. Charles VII, once mocked as the king of burghers for his tiny domain, understood that divine favor was not enough to win a war. He needed a modern army, and his genius lay not in leading charges, but in recognizing and empowering brilliant minds. History remembers him as Charles the Well-Served, a title that speaks to his greatest strength: his unparalleled skill in choosing the right advisors and giving them the authority to transform his kingdom. He learned the hard way that a kingdom reliant on feudal levies, nobles who served for only 40 days a year, could never hope to expel a determined enemy. The English, with their professional captains and long-serving archers, had exploited this weakness for generations, so Charles decided to build something entirely new for his time. In 1445, he decreed the creation of the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, the first permanent, salaried royal army in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. This was a revolutionary break from 1,000 years of feudal tradition. These companies were not a temporary gathering of knights answering a lord's call. They were professional soldiers directly paid by the crown, swearing their loyalty to the king himself. Think of the power this gave him. He now had a corps of 1,500 heavy cavalry, men-at-arms who trained and fought together year-round, creating a disciplined force that could respond to any threat without delay. This was no longer a seasonal hobby for nobles, it was a career for the kingdom's best warriors. But Charles did not stop there. He paired this new cavalry with a powerful innovation in firepower, a master of the new science of artillery named Jean Bureau. Bureau, a former financial official, was a meticulous organizer and a tactical genius with cannon. Under his command, the French Royal Artillery became the most feared and efficient siege train in all of Europe. The Bureau brothers did not just have big guns, they had a system. They standardized calibers for ammunition, developed new aiming techniques, and moved their massive bombards with an efficiency that stunned their enemies. A castle wall that could have held out for months against traditional assaults could now be reduced to rubble in a matter of days or even hours. This combination, the relentless professional army and the unstoppable siege artillery, fundamentally rewrote the rules of the war's final chapter. The English, masters of the defensive longbow formation, now found their strongholds systematically dismantled around them. How do you defend a fortress when the very stones are blasted out from under you? The French crown, for so long on the defensive, now possessed the perfect instrument for reconquest, a hammer that would methodically shatter every last English foothold on the continent. The thunder of the cannon now began to drown out the twang of the longbow. While the English had mastered a weapon that could decimate armies in the field, the French under Charles VII perfected a weapon that could conquer the land itself. This revolution was engineered by two brilliant brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau. They were not just soldiers, they were master organizers and pioneers of a new scientific approach to war. Their genius lay not in inventing the cannon, but in perfecting it as a reliable system. They introduced standardized calibers for their guns, which meant that every cannon of a certain size used identical, interchangeable stone or iron shot. This simple innovation was a logistical miracle. No longer did an army need to carry a chaotic assortment of ammunition for a dozen different bespoke guns. Supply trains became efficient, and gunners could always be sure they had the right shot for the weapon at hand. The Bureau brothers also redesigned gun carriages to be more mobile and stable, allowing their artillery train to keep pace with the army and be ready to fire from solid, well-positioned platforms. The effect on siege warfare was nothing short of apocalyptic. For centuries, a strong castle with high, thick walls was a nearly insurmountable obstacle. A defending garrison could sit behind their fortifications and watch an enemy army waste away for months in a fruitless blockade. But now the rules were rewritten. The French would arrive at an English-held fortress, and instead of settling in for a long wait, they would immediately begin the methodical work of destruction. Jean Bureau would position his bombards, the massive siege guns, and his lighter culverins with mathematical precision. A relentless, concentrated bombardment would then begin. Massive stone balls hurled with terrifying force would slam into the same section of wall again and again. The masonry would not just crack, it would disintegrate, crumbling into a heap of rubble and dust. A breach wide enough for an army to storm would be opened not in a year, not in a season, but in a matter of days. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. How could you hold a castle when its walls, your one source of security, were being systematically erased before your eyes. One by one, the English strongholds in Normandy and Guyenne fell to this terrifying new form of warfare. The age of the castle, the symbol of feudal power for half a millennium, was abruptly over. In its place rose the age of the cannon, an invention that would centralize military power in the hands of the state and define the very nature of conflict for the next 400 years. The English grip on Normandy began to crumble under a new kind of pressure, one that was systematic, disciplined, and utterly relentless. King Charles VII, with his professional army and master gunners, did not seek a single glorious charge. He waged a war of reclamation, a methodical campaign to take back his kingdom town by town, castle by castle. His forces moved through the Norman countryside with an efficiency the English could not match, isolating their strongholds and bringing the Bureau brothers' artillery to bear. Walls that had stood for centuries were now vulnerable. The thunder of the cannon was not just a sound of destruction, it was the sound of a kingdom being put back together, piece by piece. This slow, grinding advance culminated in a field near the village of Formigny in the spring of 1450. An English army, trying to relieve the besieged town of Caen, took up a strong defensive position, their longbowmen ready to create another Agincourt. But the French had learned. They did not charge into the arrow storm. Instead, they maneuvered their two large cannons into range and opened fire. The massive stone shot tore through the English lines, not killing in great numbers, but doing something far more important. It broke their formation. The disciplined ranks of archers, the foundation of English power for over a century, were forced to scatter and waver. In that moment of chaos, a force of French cavalry slammed into their flank. The battle became a rout. Formigny was not just a victory, it was a statement. The Longbow's era of dominance on the battlefield was over. Within a year, Normandy, held by England for generations, was entirely back in French hands. But Charles was not finished. He then turned his armies south to the rolling hills of Gascony, the very heart of the old English Aquitaine. This was the Black Prince's land, the source of English wine and wealth for 300 years. The French advance was just as methodical here, and the final, brutal punctuation to the war came at Castillon in 1453. The English commander, the veteran John Talbot, rushed to relieve a besieged town and saw what he believed was a lightly defended French camp. It was a trap. The French had not made a camp, they had constructed a fortified artillery park, a killing ground surrounded by trenches and palisades, with dozens of cannons positioned for a crossfire. Talbot, a warrior from the old school, ordered an immediate charge. His knights and men-at-arms surged forward, only to be met by a wall of fire and iron. The French gunners, safe behind their defenses, fired volley after volley directly into the packed English ranks. It was a slaughter. Talbot and his son died amid the carnage, their army destroyed. The Battle of Castillon stands as a stark symbol of a military revolution complete. The age of the chivalric charge had been ended by the calculated science of artillery. With this victory, the French reconquest was all but finished. The great English empire in France, built over the course of a century, was reduced to a single, solitary foothold, the port town of Calais. A war that had begun with a king's claim to a throne ended with the quiet, final closing of a gate. The Great War with France did not conclude with a triumphant ceremony or a lasting treaty. Instead, it simply bled out, its final life seeping away as England turned its armies and its fury upon itself. The staggering cost of a century of conflict had bankrupted the royal treasury and shattered the national spirit. The king who now sat on the English throne, Henry VI, was a gentle and pious man, but he was utterly unsuited to the brutal realities of 15th century rule. He inherited the mental instability of his French grandfather, Charles VI, suffering from bouts of catatonia that left him unable to speak or govern. This created a dangerous void at the very center of power. The proud English nobility, humiliated by the loss of their ancestral lands in France and embittered by the crown's inability to pay its debts, fractured into warring factions. The great houses of York and Lancaster, both branches of the royal Plantagenet family, now saw each other not as cousins but as rivals for a vacant throne. The deep-seated resentments that had festered for a generation finally ignited in the year 1455 with the first clash of what would become known as the Wars of the Roses. This was not a single battle but a 30-year-long civil war, a chaotic and brutal struggle where the White Rose of York fought the Red Rose of Lancaster in a bloody contest for the crown. How could a kingdom that had once threatened to conquer France now tear its own heart out? The answer lay in the exhaustion and the debt left by the 100 Years' War. England's military energy, its financial resources, and its best commanders were now entirely consumed by this internal fire. There were no armies left to send across the Channel, no money to fund new campaigns, and no national will to continue a lost cause. The great continental struggle, which had defined 5 generations, ended not with a decisive bang, but with the distant, fading echo of English battle cries on home soil. That final English foothold at Calais was secured not just by soldiers, but by mountains of gold and silver. A war spanning more than 100 years could not be won by courage alone. It was a colossal financial undertaking that pushed the treasuries of both England and France to the absolute breaking point. The very business of conflict, of paying thousands of archers and building fleets and forging cannons, forced both kingdoms to invent new and often ruthless systems of taxation. These financial pressures did more than fund armies. They permanently reshaped the relationship between the king and his people, forging the foundations of the modern state in the crucible of economic necessity. In England, the crown discovered it could not simply demand money. The power of the purse was firmly held by Parliament, which used its control over taxation to extract political concessions. Each new war subsidy required negotiation, establishing the fundamental precedent that the king must seek consent to raise revenue. To fill the royal coffers, the government turned to the nation's most valuable commodity, wool. Heavy export taxes were placed on every sack of wool shipped to the clothmakers of Flanders, making the wool trade a primary source of war funding, but even this was not enough. The crown reached directly into the homes of its subjects with the hearth tax, a charge on every fireplace, and most infamously, the poll tax, a flat fee levied on every single adult. This blunt instrument of revenue fell hardest on the poor, and its crushing weight was the final spark that ignited the peasants' revolt, a violent reminder that a population pushed too far could turn its anger inward. Across the Channel, the French monarchy was building its own financial engine for survival. They developed a more sophisticated and permanent system centered on the taille, a direct land tax that became the bedrock of royal income. Unlike the temporary war subsidies in England, the taille evolved into a regular and predictable source of revenue collected by a growing class of royal officials. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. The tax funded a professional standing army, and that army ensured the tax could be collected from a pacified kingdom. Can you see the profound divergence taking shape? In England, the cost of war strengthened the power of a representative body, Parliament. In France, it strengthened the central authority of the crown and its bureaucracy. Both systems were born from the same desperate need to pay for a century of battle, proving that the most lasting legacy of the war was not found on the muddy fields of Agincourt, but in the quiet, relentless work of the tax collector. The very definition of a warrior was rewritten by the longbow string. For centuries, the armored knight on his charging destrier was the undisputed master of the European battlefield, a symbol of feudal power and social order. But at Crécy and Agincourt, that symbol was systematically dismantled by common men. The French knightly class did not just suffer defeat, it was methodically slaughtered. The flower of French nobility lay trampled in the mud, not in glorious single combat, but in a chaotic, anonymous hail of arrows. This decimation created a crisis for the aristocracy. Their wealth, drained by ransoms and the cost of new armor, could no longer protect their status. Their military role, the very reason for their privileged existence, was suddenly in question. How could a social order built on the premise that knights were the ultimate warriors survive when those warriors were so easily defeated? The traditional power of the feudal aristocracy, already strained by the Black Death, was dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. Across the Channel, a different social transformation was underway. The English yeoman, the free commoner who owned a small plot of land, found his status elevated by his own right arm. His skill with the longbow made him an indispensable part of the kingdom's military success. This was not a feudal service performed out of obligation to a local lord. This was a professional duty for which he was paid. The wages of war, however meager, gave him a new economic independence and a newfound pride. He returned from France not as a humble peasant, but as a veteran who had helped topple dukes and kings. This created a quiet confidence among the common classes, a belief that their contribution mattered, a sentiment that would echo through future conflicts and shape the evolution of English society. Alongside these yeomen emerged another new figure, the professional captain. These were men who raised companies of soldiers and contracted their services to the crown. They fought for profit and a share of the plunder. Their loyalty tied more to their paymaster and their own advancement than to any ancient feudal oath. Warfare was becoming a business, and these captains were its ambitious entrepreneurs. Yet for every town enriched by royal contracts for arrows, armor, and ships, there were a dozen villages that knew only ash and terror. The English strategy of the chevauchée was economic warfare in its most brutal form. These were not battles for territory, but massive, calculated raids deep into the French countryside. Columns of mounted English soldiers would sweep through undefended regions, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and razing entire villages to the ground. The goal was twofold: to cripple the French king's tax base by destroying his wealth, and to shatter his political legitimacy by proving he could not protect his own people. The human cost was staggering. Imagine the scene: the smoke on the horizon, the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the desperate flight into the woods. For the French peasant, the war was not a distant contest of kings. It was the smell of your burning home and the sight of your family starving through the winter. This constant, grinding violence frayed the old bonds of feudal loyalty. A local lord hiding in his castle offered no protection from this kind of terror. Survival increasingly depended on the power of a larger, more distant authority, the king himself, who alone could field an army to drive the invaders out. Out of this century of smoke and fire, a new idea began to take root: the concept of a nation. The endless conflict forced people on both sides of the Channel to think of themselves not just as subjects of a lord, or even as servants of a king, but as something more. The English archer at Agincourt fought for his king, but he also fought for England. The French peasant, terrorized by chevauchée, prayed for a savior not from his local baron, but for a king who could unite and defend France. The war forged these identities in the crucible of shared suffering and shared victory. It subtly reshaped the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, moving it away from a personal feudal contract and toward a broader, more abstract bond of national belonging. This was the profound and lasting social upheaval, the quiet revolution that outlived every treaty and every battle, forever changing what it meant to belong to a kingdom. The sea itself became the first battlefield. Before a single arrow flew at Crécy, the fate of the war was decided on the water. King Edward III knew his grand claim to the French throne was meaningless if he could not get his armies across the Channel. In the summer of 1340, a massive French fleet lay at anchor off the coast of Flanders near the port of Slues. It was an invasion force, a collection of over 200 ships, including swift and deadly Genos galleys hired by the French crown. Their mission was to blockade England and prepare for a landing that could have ended the war before it truly began. Edward saw this armada not as a barrier but as a target. He led his own fleet, outnumbered but fiercely determined, straight into the anchored French lines. What followed was less a naval battle and more a floating slaughterhouse. The English ships closed in, and their secret weapon went to work. Hundreds of longbowmen stood shoulder to shoulder on the decks, raining down a continuous storm of arrows onto the French and Genos sailors. The effect was devastating. The enemy decks were swept clear of defenders, turning organized resistance into panicked chaos. With the French crews decimated, English men-at-arms swarmed aboard the immobilized vessels, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat across blood-slicked planks. The fighting was so ferocious that chroniclers of the time wrote that the sea appeared red with blood for miles. When the last sword fell, the French fleet was all but erased. Very few ships escaped capture or destruction. This was not just a victory, it was annihilation. The Battle of Slues secured English mastery of the Channel for the next 40 years. It guaranteed that English troops and supplies could flow freely to the continent, while simultaneously slamming the door shut on any French hopes of invading England. From that day forward, the English could choose when and where to fight, using the sea as their protective moat and their strategic highway. This naval supremacy became the silent, unshakable foundation upon which every subsequent English campaign was built, a lesson in the profound power of controlling the waters that separated two rival kingdoms. A war fought for land and crowns ultimately conquered the imagination. The sprawling conflict did not just redraw maps, it forged the very idea of what it meant to be English or French, embedding its stories so deeply into each culture that they became inseparable from national identity. In England, the astonishing victories at Crécy and Agincourt were woven into a powerful and enduring national myth. They were not remembered as bloody, chaotic slaughters, but as testaments to the character of a nation, where the disciplined common man with his longbow could humble the pride of a continental aristocracy. This narrative of the plucky underdog triumphing against overwhelming odds became a cornerstone of the English spirit, celebrated in popular chronicles and later immortalized for all time in the stirring words of William Shakespeare. His play Henry V transformed a medieval king into a timeless icon of leadership and national resolve, with speeches that would echo in English ears for centuries. Across the Channel, France crafted its own powerful story from the raw materials of defeat and redemption. The initial, humiliating losses and the internal chaos were not forgotten, but they were reframed as a necessary trial, a dark night that made the dawn of liberation all the more brilliant. The figure of Joan of Arc became the ultimate symbol of this national resurrection. Her story transformed a century of complex feudal politics into a simple, sacred drama, a trial by fire that purified and united the kingdom. She embodied the idea that France itself was worth any sacrifice, fostering a powerful narrative of resilience and divine favor that would fuel French patriotism for generations. This cultural transformation even reshaped the very language of power. In England, the long association of French with the enemy and the rising pride in English military achievements helped to complete a linguistic shift that had been slowly underway. By the end of the war, English had firmly replaced Norman French as the language of the royal court, of administration, and of the law. This was more than a change in vocabulary. It was a declaration of cultural independence, ensuring that the business of the nation would be conducted in the tongue of its people. The 100 Years' War, therefore, proved that the most enduring legacy of any great conflict is not found in dusty treaties or abandoned battlefields. It lives on in the stories a people choose to tell about themselves, in the heroes they celebrate, and in the shared identity forged in the crucible of shared struggle. These stories, passed down through art, literature, and collective memory, became the true, unbreakable spoils of war. Individual courage was no longer enough to guarantee victory on the battlefield. The chaotic charges of armored knights, once the ultimate expression of medieval warfare, were systematically dismantled by the English reliance on discipline and combined arms. This was not a rejection of bravery, but a fundamental shift in how wars were won. The English system integrated different types of soldiers into a single, cohesive machine. At the center stood the dismounted men at arms, knights and professional soldiers who formed a solid, defensive line. On the flanks, the longbowmen provided a devastating, long-range punch. And protecting them all were simple field fortifications like the sharpened stakes at Agincourt that turned a defensive position into a deadly trap. This coordination between infantry, archers, and obstacles demonstrated a new level of tactical thinking, where the whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. How do you defeat an army that fights as a single, disciplined entity rather than a collection of individual heroes? The French answer was to build an institution that could match this professionalism. The Ordonnance of 1439 created the first permanent, standing army in Western Europe since the days of the Roman legions. This was a revolutionary break from 1,000 years of feudal tradition. No longer would the king have to rely on nobles who served for only 40 days a year before returning home. Instead, he now commanded a corps of paid professional soldiers, the compagnies d'ordonnance, who trained and fought together year-round. Their loyalty was not to a local duke or count, but directly to the crown and the salary it provided. This created a force that was always ready, always disciplined, and entirely under the king's control. The final nail in the coffin for the age of chivalry was the rising thunder of gunpowder. The early cannons were unpredictable and slow, but by the war's end, they had been refined into true battle-winning weapons. The masterful use of artillery by the French Bureau brothers did more than just knock down castle walls. It shattered an entire way of life. The castle, the ultimate symbol of a local lord's power and independence, was suddenly vulnerable. No fortress could long withstand a sustained scientific bombardment, and the knight in his shining plate armor, the pinnacle of feudal society, was now just as vulnerable to a cannonball as the lowest foot soldier. Success in war now depended on factors the old knights never had to consider: the deep coffers of a state to pay a permanent army, the logistical genius to keep them supplied, and the technological innovation to stay ahead of the enemy. The battlefield had been transformed from a stage for personal glory into a complex machine run by the state itself. Even with all we know, the shadow of the unknown still falls across this century of conflict. For all the chronicles and treaties, the 100 Years' War holds onto its secrets, leaving us with puzzles that historians still passionately debate. Take the enigma of Joan of Arc and the voices that guided her. Were they a true spiritual encounter, a genuine conversation with saints as she believed? Could they have been the product of a neurological or psychological condition, a powerful manifestation of her own deep faith and the immense stress of her world? Or were they, as some skeptics have suggested, a brilliant political ploy, a story carefully crafted by her or her supporters to lend divine authority to a desperate military cause? We may never know the ultimate truth of her experience, yet its impact remains undeniably real, a force that changed history. Then there is the dark mystery on the bridge at Montereau. The assassination of John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, in 1419 was a political earthquake, but its precise trigger is still obscured by conflicting accounts. Was it a cold-blooded, premeditated murder ordered by the Dauphin Charles to remove a powerful rival? Or was it a spontaneous act of violence, a chaotic confrontation that spiraled fatally out of control? The motives of every man on that bridge are lost to time, yet the consequences of that single violent act would dictate the alliance that nearly conquered France. On a broader scale, economists still grapple with the war's ultimate financial legacy. Did the relentless strain of taxation and destruction ultimately forge stronger, more centralized fiscal states in both England and France, forcing them to build modern financial systems? Or did it simply cripple their economies for generations, leaving a legacy of debt and devastated countryside from which it took decades to recover? The evidence points in both directions, a paradox of destruction and innovation. Even the name we use for this entire era is a later invention, a tidy label applied by historians looking back. For the people who lived through those 116 years, it was not one single war but a grim series of separate struggles, a rhythm of fighting and fragile peace that defined entire lifetimes. These enduring questions are not mere academic exercises. They are what keep the story alive, ensuring that the 100 Years' War remains not just a closed chapter in a history book, but a living, breathing field of discovery where our understanding is still being written. The 100 Years' War was far more than a simple dynastic dispute over a vacant throne. It was the violent crucible in which the modern nations of England and France were forged. Over a century of conflict shattered the old feudal order, where a king was merely the greatest of many competing lords. In its place rose the early framework of the sovereign state, a centralized power with a professional army, a permanent bureaucracy, and the authority to tax its citizens directly. The thunder of cannon at Castillon did not just signal the end of a battle, it announced the end of an era where castle walls meant security. The quiet diplomacy at Arras demonstrated that shifting alliances could be more decisive than any charge of knights. This long war forced a profound shift in identity. People on both sides of the Channel began to think of themselves not just as subjects of a local lord, but as part of a larger community, a nation with a shared destiny and a common enemy. The peasant archer at Agincourt fought for his king, but he also fought for England. The French farmer, terrorized by chevauchés, prayed for a savior who would unite and defend all of France. This conflict, with its epic scale and human drama, stands as a monumental testament to ambition, to resilience, and to the human capacity for profound change. It is the story of how a century of fire and blood laid the very foundations of the world we live in today.